Hello to everybody. Welcome to Grasp SFI. This week we have Vijay Kumar. I have the easy job of introducing him because all of you know him. You probably also know many of his accolades, the appointments in multiple departments, and the fact that he's dean. What you guys might not know and what today's talk is about is that he worked in the White House. So from 2012 to 2013, he was the Assistant Director of Robotics and Cyber Physical Systems at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I think this talk is apt that he's speaking about this right now because it's election week. To talk just very briefly on that, I know that with election week, no matter what your political views are, no matter whether you're an American citizen or an international student or whatnot, a lot of people have a wide range of feelings, emotions, and whatnot this week. But I'm excited to kind of take a step back from those individual views and these civic duties as citizens and talk a little bit about how we as scientists, as engineers, as academics might contribute to the policy realm. So again, thank you, Vijay, for joining us. And it's really an honor to have you speak here and speak about this experience.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. The honor is mine. Anytime a student committee invites me, I consider that something that I should put on my resume. So thank you for inviting me to speak. I also want to thank you for baiting me to selecting this date. When I said I was free in November, I didn't think this through, that I would be speaking after the day of the general elections.
Yeah, I honestly didn't either. It's I guess a happy coincidence, depending on how you view it.
Yeah, happy or otherwise. But you're right. This is a good time to be talking about the role that the federal government plays in our lives, especially those of us who are committed to education and research in science and technology. Can you see my my screen?
Yeah, right now we're looking at presenter view.
Thank you for telling me that. I will try to switch this around. Reshare this. Did I get this right?
Yeah, I'm seeing your slides. They're a bit zoomed in right now, but I'm seeing just the slides.
Really?
Yeah, it's quite zoomed in though. There we go. Okay, try again.
Okay, let's try again. This time, hopefully it works. Did that work?
No, we're seeing the same thing.
Ah, that's weird because I just got off a call where I did all of this successfully.
While you're working on that, one reminder that I didn't mention to the audience who is here listening, we have the Q&A at the bottom. If you guys at any time during the presentation would like to submit questions, at the end, we, as the panelists here, will be kind of going through those questions and asking them to Vijay. So at any point, you guys can post them there, and we will put those forward at the end.
I'm sorry, I'm just rebooting PowerPoint.
No, that's fine.
So maybe I can get started while PowerPoint is extraordinarily slow today. I can get started by telling you a little bit about the context for my remarks. As Matt mentioned, I spent 18 months in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And we still have a very active group called OSTP 24. It's a 44. It's a mailing list. 44. Obviously, President Obama was the 44th president, and it's quite a community. And that was an enjoyable time in my life. I got to meet a lot of people, develop a very nice network of friends. Let me try again. Hopefully this time it'll work.
Maybe try swap displays. That's an option.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, yeah.
My
Top
mouse
left.
has just disappeared. How's this? I mirror the screen now.
Great, perfect.
Great, that's perfect.
Okay, good. So this is what OSTP 44 looks like. This is a timeline. It stretches from 2009 through 2017, and you can see the number of people involved. You can also see the number of lines which get terminated and then restarted. So a lot of people came in and spent some time there and moved on. So my name appears over here. You can see this orange line on the top. And if you go to the third row, and if you use a magnifying glass, you would probably see my picture somewhere here. But there's just a lot of people involved in this office. So I thought I'd start by saying a little bit about what the office does. There are two roles, really. You can think about it as S&T for policy and policy for S&T. So what science and technology issues do you need to truly understand to inform policymaking? And today, there's just numerous ones. We're living in the midst of a pandemic. Any decision you make without understanding how the disease gets transmitted, how the pandemic grows, I mean, it's just pointless. So there's a lot of science that goes into it, but you can also go beyond that. You can think about climate change. To me, the most striking thing was in 2018 when Senator Orrin Hatch questioned Mark Zuckerberg, and he said something like, this was in 2018, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service? And Zuckerberg, to his credit, without batting an eyelid, said, Senator, we run ads. So here's a great example. This is a congressional hearing where they're trying to rein in the powers of Facebook, a big economy, without trying to understand anything, which teenagers know how this works. But this is important, right? So how do you articulate and make sure everybody understands the key issues before you embark on something like, let's rein in Facebook? I think the other piece is, how do you know what issues should be pursued in science and technology? And when I say that, I just don't mean research, I also mean education. So ours was not a funding agency. In fact, if you look at the net budget, annual budget of OSTP, it's about 4 million to 5 million. I don't know if it's grown substantially, but it's a pretty small budget. The agencies that write checks are the Department of Defense agencies, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, US Department of Agriculture, and many, many, many more. They are the ones that write checks. And there's an office in the White House called OMB, Office of Management and Budget, a very powerful office. So that's the office that allocates funding to funding agencies. But remember, the president proposes the budget, and there's a lot of congressional oversight. And so we've seen that both during the Obama administration and the Trump administration. The president has priorities, but ultimately at the end of the day, the Senate has to pass it, the House has to pass it. So there's a lot of a give and take, and OMB essentially monitors that process and executes. So if you look at the OSTP staff, such as myself, we were never paid by the government. We were paid by foundations, federal agencies sometimes. So Lynn Parker, who spoke not so long ago, she was supported by the National Science Foundation, if I remember correctly. When I was there, Penn paid for me to be there, not explicitly, because I had a sabbatical leave, and I chose to spend 60% of my time at the White House Office of Science and Technology. when I was there, I mean, not only was it an honor to be offered this position, it was a privilege, but it was also exciting time. So you should remember that President Obama took over from President George W. Bush. And there are two quotes that I remember. The first, after lamenting 8 years of neglect in the White House on science and technology policy, he came out and said, "We will restore science to its rightful place. We'll transform our schools, our colleges, and universities to meet the demands of a new age." So to me, this was the refrain in my mind when I approached anything during those 18 months. And the other piece, and again, if you're the president, you always have to think about national competitiveness and so on, but it's very different from how it's articulated during the Trump administration. This is about reaffirming our role as the engine for scientific discovery and technological innovation. Sure, it's about competitiveness, but ultimately at the end of the day, whether you are an undergraduate student, a master's student, a PhD student, a faculty member, a lab director, or a school, you want to be known for discovery and innovation. And that's what he emphasized. So to me, that was also a rallying cry. And again, at the end of the day, I was probably the first time I heard the word robotics coming out of a president. So manufacturing, of course, has always been a big theme in the White House. But the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, this is PCAST, it's a very powerful advisory board, came out and said, well, if you're going to have manufacturing in the US, you have to invest in robotics. Robotics is one of the 11 key technologies. And so once again, the stage was set to do something impactful. So in addition to robotics and manufacturing, I was telling some of you before this webcast started, big data was a thing that came of age, open government, and the idea that you can actually expose much of the data the government has to create more efficiencies. The Obama administration really put a lot of emphasis on STEM education. I want to say a little bit about grand challenges in a minute, but the other portfolio that I was responsible for, in addition to robotics and manufacturing, was cyber physical systems. And again, I'll say a little bit about that. In some sense, my first exposure to thinking about technology and policy came through an initiative led by a whole bunch of academics. Henrik Christensen at Georgia Tech was the ringleader for the team. I was the Penn representative from USC, Maya Matarich, Johns Hopkins, there was Allison Okamura. I'm trying to think of who else, Rensselaer Polytechnic, Jeffrey Trinkle, University of Utah, was John Hollabach, Matt Mason from Carnegie Mellon. So through a series of workshops, we came together to ask ourselves the question, why robotics? Who cares? Where's the demand and what's the driver? And when we said driver, we said this has got to be about socioeconomic drivers. And that led us to define technology gaps. We'd love to have an autonomous robot, for example, in an operating theater with no surgeons around, but that's clearly very hard to do. So what are the gaps and what are the capabilities we need to develop? And we try to define from that the fundamental advances needed to cover those technology gaps and what basic research needs to be funded. We came up with a roadmap with 5, 10, and 15-year goals, and this is a technology roadmap. This was a big thing, and we kind of had that in place. It was serendipitous because when President Obama took over, he was looking for new ideas. And of course, something that was synergistic to robotics appealed. And so we were in the right place at the right time, but we'd done our homework. So 5 years later in 2013, this was updated. And now it's in the process of being updated 5 years later. Should have been in 2018, 2019, but it's going to be in 2020. But the idea that even though we're an academic community, we're always thinking about socioeconomic impact and what kind of research and development needs to be done in universities. And concurrent with that is, of course, educational initiatives. So this is key. This was a this is to my chagrin. The president chose to announce this in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon. We announced the robotics initiative. We know that Pennsylvania is a battleground state. Well, it was a battleground state back in 2008. And he probably, I'm going to guess, saw that 2012 would be no different. And let's face it, Philadelphia is going to vote Democrat anyway. So I thought maybe that was the reason this is how I rationalized it to myself. But nevertheless, it was a great thing for robotics. I mean, the president actually coming out and launching an initiative in robotics was a huge thing for the community. So the National Robotics Initiative, and I try to pull out one slide that I had been using, it was really about co-robots. The idea that robots don't replace human beings, they support human beings. They support individuals, they support groups of individuals. So these are machines that will work with humans as co-workers, as co-protectors, as if you think about the defense industry, as co-drivers, if you think about self-driving cars, which weren't anywhere close to where the technology is nowhere close to where it is now, co-explorers in the context of NASA, co-inhabitants, think about humans occupying the International Space Station or planets, personal safety, health, productivity, but everywhere there was a prefix co, which was very important to the NRI. And there was some validation. This is a McKinsey report back in 2012, got published in 2013. They published what they call the Disruptive Dozen. Disruption was a new word back then, by the way. So the idea that you could identify 12 technologies that were going to disrupt the world, that was great. What was even better is that 2 of the 12 technologies had something to do with robotics, right? And so this was validation that the commercial world was also thinking about robotics as something disruptive. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of how things were back in 2012. Along with the National Robotics Initiative, the idea of coworkers and so on was the idea that you would think about new domains. And here I list 4 different domains. And the first 4 federal agencies that started partnering with OSTP on this initiative, National Science Foundation, clearly the leader. NASA, you could see this humanoid robot on a balancing Segway. Agriculture, USDA was involved. And then the other one is NIH in terms of healthcare applications. So again, this balance between fundamental areas, some of which are still fundamental areas, actually most of these are, a balance between that and kind of mission-driven research. And then cyber physical systems, this idea that you have networked embedded systems supporting sensing, actuation, and computation, with the difference being that you really thought about safety critical systems, real-time guaranteed performance, applications where the blue screen of death could not be tolerated. And you could see, again, this balance between fundamental themes on the right side and the left side, thinking about transportation networks, manufacturing networks, networks inside a hospital, inside an ICU. And so how do you bring these things together? And by the way, this is also a challenge at a time when the minute you utter the word cyber as a challenge, people immediately said cybersecurity, and that was a big thing. So to explain to them that cyber is actually in the physical world in 2012 was a challenging thing, especially in Washington, D.C., where the attention span generally is quite short. So I worked in the technology and innovation division, and I just want to share with you sort of 2 quotes that were again rallying themes. So one, if you've taken a course in engineering entrepreneurship, and I think most business majors would have heard of it. This comes from the Harvard Business School, Howard Stevenson, and I very much like this because it talks about what a true definition of entrepreneurship is without thinking about what it is you're interested in. So it's the pursuit of opportunity without thinking about what resources you control. Anytime you're given a challenge, you say, well, I can do that if only I had X, Y, and Z. But what if you could think of what you wanted to do without having access to those resources? Well, again, I want you to put yourselves in our shoes, OSTP 44 in 2012, 2013, where we had a Democrat in the White House, but Congress and the Senate were tightly controlled by Republicans. So we control very few resources. And so I always used to joke that the White House always broke. And so in spite of that, we're involved in all these amazing projects. How do you do that? And the second part of it, and this Tom Khalil was my boss. I don't know how many of you remember in 2018, he spoke in the fall of 2018, he spoke in the school. But a remarkable guy. He tried to think about leveraging resources that he didn't, that the federal government had, but he didn't have access to. So he tried to constitute motivated individuals or small teams that can do a lot to draw attention to real problems, real challenges, and present innovative policy solutions and build coalitions. So this is what I spend majority of my time doing during the NRI, during the Advanced Manufacturing Initiative, and during the CPS initiative as they were growing. So my role was actually not that hard to get agencies, policymakers to get excited about CPS and robotics education and research. Once you got beyond the point that, hey, CPS is a real thing, cyber embedded in the physical world, how hard it is to explain that if you don't get the cyber right, your plane will come crashing down. If you don't get the cyber right, your robots in the operating room will make safety critical mistakes. So that was not too hard, but still you had to drive home that message and say, this is fundamental to the next generation of technologies. This is fundamental research. It's fundamental to, it's an important part of our educational agenda. Then the second piece was to focus on opportunities and funding gaps. I just sort of talked about that very briefly. And then outreach. So outreach to 3 different constituencies. So I never lost an opportunity to speak to high school students. Robotics Week started around that. Now it's an ongoing thing. One of my memorable memories I have is speaking at the Smithsonian to a whole bunch of high school students, and I treasure that. Speaking to the general public about opportunities, that was great. And then speaking to the federal agencies. So again, some of these agencies like NSF gets it. NSF thinks like you do or I do. But at that time, there were a few enlightened program managers at NIH, but not many. So I would go speak to them. Department of Transportation, they would say, what do we have to do with robotics? But of course, at that time, the National Highway Transportation Administration was thinking about what it would mean to certify cars, what level 1 autonomy would mean, what level 2 autonomy would mean. And to tell them how to think about robotics, how these different levels were, ought to be characterized. And by the way, I personally believe that's the wrong way to do it, but they were wedded to that. And so, talking to them about that was an important thing. The FAA, and because we were working on aerial robots and autonomy, I had a conflict of interest. The White House lawyers were very clear. I could not promote anything that would benefit the University of Pennsylvania in any way, the GRASP lab in any way, my own students in any way. So we had, and again, by today's standards, that bar seemed to be pretty high. But I truly understand what conflict of interest meant. So whatever I did with FAA had to be private. It had to be behind the scenes, but I did develop a lot of interesting connections with the FAA back then. And then I tried to influence the budget, which is very tricky. So that's why the word try is italicized. OMB has many bosses. But above all, the Office of Management and Budget has the primary responsibility of being fiscally prudent, being responsible, and not running a deficit. And again, by today's standards, that seems ridiculous, but that was the deal. So anytime I went and said, for example, the USDA needs to really think about precision agriculture, vertical farming, which were the first times that USDA actually launched investments in these technologies. they had to take some money out of some other pot. And so they were reluctant to do that, understandably. And that's why I used the word, I had the word try in italics. Not sure I was very successful. And then one thing that really happened was opportunity to promote SBIR opportunities across all programs. And this is something you may not know, but the Small Business Innovative Research Program mandated by the federal government requires every funding agency to allocate 3.2% of its overall budget to small businesses. So today, and by the way, the federal government, if you look at the overall budget today for R&D, it's about 120 billion. Of course, the part that the 3.2% applies to is the part for extramural funding, but still it's a sizable amount. And so today you think about starting companies and you think about venture money, you think about accelerators, you think about angel rounds, you think about Series A. And what people don't think about is that there's a similar approach that you can go through the federal government. The great thing about it is that the federal government doesn't own equity in your company. So this is your company and you can essentially take it in a direction that you want. Of course, you have to have an agency that's interested in this. But as I think some of you know, we've had SBIR funded companies come out of our lab. Stephen Chen in my group is doing great with an NSF phase 1 SBIR grant. And the selection committee is top notch. They have great program managers. And all of this was just getting ramped up back in 2011, 2012 in the area of robotics. Another thing I tried to do is to develop ideas and support for grand challenges. So what does grand challenges mean? So you have to go back to President Kennedy for defining the ultimate grand challenge. So in 1963, I think many of you were not born, but you surely know this. These were his words: by defining our goal more clearly and make it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all peoples to see it, draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. And of course, he was talking about putting a man on the moon. And this was in 1963, and we had our own version of this. We wanted to create grand challenges, and again, in the words of Tom Khalil, ambitious and yet achievable goals that capture our imagination and require innovation and breakthroughs in science and technology to achieve them. So if you think about grand challenges, they can't be way too hard. They can't be too easy. They've got to have this Goldilocks flavor of just right. So obviously, curing cancer is a grand challenge, but it's not a grand challenge in this setting. So putting a human being on the moon was a grand challenge. Getting a self-driving car to drive from California to New York, that would be a grand challenge. But the grand challenges I was involved in, and the person who really did a great job in trying to find this sweet spot was Gil Pratt. Some of you know him. He's with Toyota Research Institute, but he was the architect of the DARPA Robotics Challenge. Again, many of you were familiar. Some of you may have even worked on this. But the idea of this was to have a humanoid robot work in a disaster zone and do something meaningful in disaster recovery. The idea that a robot could truly do something that a human being could not in a humanitarian mission. So this definition really did capture people's imagination. It was easy to sell that. This had that Goldilocks flavor. Now, privately, you and I could debate whether anything useful came out of this. I think a lot of students were funded. I know the GRASP lab, Kostas Danielidis worked on this project, and his students worked. And so I think a lot of interesting things happened. But on the other hand, the project was not as successful as Kennedy's challenge of putting a human being on the moon. Another one that Gil Pratt formulated was something we're very familiar with, this idea of fast, lightweight autonomy. But his grand challenge was really interesting. It was about trying to get an aerial vehicle to fly so fast that it defies human perception. So you might say, what is it about a drone that defies human perception? I mean, it's buzzing, it's making this noise. But what if it went so fast that by the time you hear it and you think you saw it, it's gone, right? So, and his idea was that if you had something like that, and of course he was working for DARPA, and so he thought that would be the perfect scout for clandestine operations. That was his grand challenge. Of course, it did not have that Goldilocks flavor. It was abandoned, and then it ended up as non-traditional perception and autonomy methods to enable a new class of algorithms. So this is something you and I would resonate with, right? So it's not abstract, like putting somebody on the moon. This is something very concrete. And of course, after I left OSTP, the program came out. We were allowed to write a proposal. And, Costas, CJ, many of us were involved in this. And of course, that was a great program for us. Another thing we tried to formulate, again, we couldn't get the Goldilocks thing right. So in this picture, you'll see this is me in Fukushima, and this is Gil Pratt. So, and this is us underneath, below the fuel rods on Unit 5. And so we had this idea that no one knows, and actually no one still knows what's in reactor unit number 1, reactor unit number 2. Could we send robots in? Well, people had tried to send robots in, but, and they're still there. They're stuck because everything inside is very three-dimensional. So ground robots don't work. They tried snake robots. And of course, things are very unstructured. It's very hard to teleoperate these, particularly in a contaminated area. And so we had the bright idea, why don't we formulate something that would be fully autonomous, would be really, really small, and could fly. Again, really, really hard in our Goldilocks spectrum. But nevertheless, I think, as some of you may know, TEPCO is very interested in this idea, Tokyo Electric and Power Company, and did end up funding at least one piece of this work, which many students in my group worked on, led by Dinesh, and it was very successful as a research project. But I just want to give you this sense of trying to formulate grand challenges that you can then use to push research and development, to attract students, and to push an agenda in federal across 2 federal agencies. The last thing, which is I got recruited into this, is to support immigration reform. And I know many of you are international students. We all come from different countries. This is obviously something near and dear to me. I got naturalized in 1996. And I was recruited because of that. And there were a bunch of us. And this was a time when there was I'd like to think that the backlash against immigration was starting at that time. And it was not just in rural countries. It was not just among President Trump's supporters, but also professional organizations like IEEE could see that professionals, electrical engineers born in the US, trained in the US, were being replaced by non-US citizens who were brought in at a fraction of the cost, and they had to train those people to take their own jobs. And so there was a lot of anti-immigration sentiment. And of course, President Obama tried very hard to push this agenda through. And so part of my job was to forever make cases like the ones you see here. And these are things that I discovered back then. Half the top 50 venture-backed companies in the US had a foreign founder or co-founder. 40% of Wall Street Journal's $1 billion startup club, the founders were not born in the US. And then you look at Google, Microsoft, Pepsi, McDonald's, all these companies had top-ranked executives who were not born in the US. And at that time, there was an urgent need to reform the H-1B system to protect not only the US-born professionals, but also allow a flow of talent. And at that time, there was bipartisan support. Of course, we know how that went, and this is still a mess. And I thought we had at one point, I was very optimistic that this would happen before 2016. It didn't happen. But this is something I got involved in, and it's something that I believed in. And people thought that I had the creds to help support this agenda. I was not leading this. A colleague of mine, Doug Rand, led this. He was amazing, and I just helped whenever I could in this initiative. So Matt, I have to talk about the election. So this was, and I don't know what it looks like today. This was at 5:15 a.m., a picture from the Wall Street Journal. So, you've all seen this picture. I was up last night. I got up early in the morning. I was obsessed about this, and very unhelpful to do all of this, by the way. But I just wanted to give you another spin on this. This was the picture this morning, and I want to show you another picture on the right side. This is the STEM share of the total workforce across the US. And if you look at the top 10 states, including the District of Columbia, you'll see there's only one red state included here, Utah. And this, to me, is a striking observation. If you think about it, you can rationalize it, you can justify it. But the fact is that STEM does not have the penetration that it deserves to have, that it should have across the US, right? And could that be, those of you who are blue-spirited, if you want to change the electoral map, maybe that's a tool in your arsenal that you should be thinking about. How do we make STEM more widely accepted across the country and across the world? And if you do that, you'll be doing a service to humanity, because of course STEM is very important. This is a bit controversial, but I personally believe that the more people exposed to STEM, the better it is for us. Perhaps not for the reasons that you want to paint the country blue, but if you do that, that will not be a differentiator. So already that's changing. So I have another chart for you. The right side is the same chart I showed you, the top 10 states in terms of the share of the workforce coming from STEM workers. On the left side, I show the top 10 states with high-tech startups, the number of high-tech startups. And you can see a lot of red states. You see Texas, you see Florida, you see Georgia, you see Virginia that flipped from red to blue. So a lot of states on the left side, which shows you that the landscape is changing. So in some ways, technology could be a solution to take this divide that we have, which is so, I want to say black and white, but really it's red and blue, and blur that. So technology can be an equalizer, and I think it's our role, no matter how political we are, how apolitical we are, it doesn't matter. This is something we should try to embrace. I mean, and that's good for the country, it's good for the world. So that's one point I would make. I think the other point I would make is, and I know I've spoken about this to many of you, this is the question about the biggest social challenge that's facing us. It's about jobs. This particular chart shows a period of about 30 years. So if you look at the plots from 1980 to 2010, you will see that manufacturing output virtually doubled. And this is in 2010 dollars, so let's not look at the numbers, but you see the scale, from the scale that the manufacturing output doubled. If you look at the red curve, that's the number of people employed, and you'll see during this exact period, the number of people in the manufacturing workforce declined by 33%. So you doubled productivity, and you did it with fewer people. Now, if this was not a Zoom session, I would probably ask you, why do you think that happened? Well, in 2000, China signed the entered into the WTO, and there were roughly 1 million jobs in manufacturing that went from the US to China. So this was not a bad thing, because in some sense it improved the efficiency of our manufacturing supply chain. China benefit from that. They sent more of their talent to the US. So this is part of innovation. Technology is a great equalizer. But what we did not do is think about how those jobs could be replaced. So when we did choose to replace them, we replaced them with jobs that could be performed with fewer workers. How did we do that? Robotics, automation. Factories became more and more automated, and the people we hired tend to be people who are specializing in sales and logistics, as opposed to welding, machining, and assembly. So we lost a lot of workers, let's face it. And that was from 2000 to 2010 or 2008, 2009. And of course, President Obama inherited all that, but he did not fix it in his 8 years. And this is something, the after effects of that we're still seeing. So this is a big social challenge. And this is not a new social challenge. I have nothing better to do, so I went to the New York Times website and dug up all these old articles. So the earliest one I found was in 1928 about robots and jobs. The march of the machine makes idle hands. 1940, does machine displace men? Sorry, back then it was always about men. Does machine displace men in the long run? 200,000 a year will lose jobs to automation, US aides say. And it goes on. In 1980, a robot is after your job. 2017, will robots take our children's jobs? Not our jobs, but our children's jobs. The 2018 one I found to be the most hilarious. If robots come for our jobs, what should our government do? Our government doesn't understand the implications of robotics, much less know what to do about it when robots do take some of these jobs over. This is a fact. For every 100,000 employees today, we have 85 industrial robots. If you think the US has it bad, actually it's much worse. This ratio is much worse in Korea, Singapore, Japan, Germany, and the world average is about 85. And this is nothing new, as I said before. I talked about manufacturing. The more egregious example is farming. 100 years ago, 1 in 3 American workers was employed in a farm, and today that number is less than 2%. So we've become very efficient. We have about 200 consumers per farmer. That is fantastic. Why didn't the farmers not revolt? Well, because this change happened over such a long period of time that people adapted. New jobs were created, people migrated to the new jobs, not like manufacturing, where it happened in 30 years, and not like what might happen going forward, which I believe is going to be different because jobs will be displaced at a faster rate. And the question is, will fewer jobs be created than destroyed? And what is the timescale of change? And I believe the timescale is going to be faster. So the farming transition happened over 100 years, and manufacturing happened over 30 years. I also have weavers, secretaries, and paralegals in the mix here. But as you think about AI and robotics and technologies like self-driving cars, if they come to pass, that change will be much faster. And I think that's something else we should think about if you're interested in this intersection of policy and technology and policy. I want to conclude with some lessons learned. Believe it or not, this was, to me, this was like a lab session. I learned how the federal government works. I grew up in India, which is a totally different form of government. It's centralized, parliamentarian. Ours is a federal government. And so you go to Washington, D.C., you expect one person to control everything. Not true. I always felt there were 13 different federal governments at work. Every agency has some autonomy. And at first, I was very frustrated because as I thought about how to make robotics the top priority of every agency, it was not easy. But now I'm actually grateful because sometimes when you don't have the leadership that you want, it's actually good to have leadership distributed across the different agencies. Of course, the federal government refers to the fact that the states are autonomous or semi-autonomous, they can do their thing, but it also works at the federal government level. Another thing I learned is that science and technology has bipartisan support. So if you go to Congress, people in Congress, people of the Senate, you talk to their staffers, everybody wants to invest in science and technology. Why? Because it's about jobs, right? And I was telling some of you before, robotics has actually played a huge role. Every congressperson, every senator goes home and talks to their kids. The kids tell them about robotics, what a cool thing it is. And they tell their parents, they educate their parents. So actually, I found my role was actually not that hard. And my own senator, at that time I was a Delaware resident, Chris Coons, heard about robotics from his son first, who was in high school. And when I talked about robotics in Wilmington, he said, "Oh yeah, I know all about this. My son told me about this." So our jobs are easier. The third thing is, I think Washington, D.C. has a lot of talent. We generally don't associate talent with government. Actually, there are a lot of smart people, people who think about policy wonks. This is their goal, very smart. Staffers are extremely smart. They're very enterprising. They want to have impact just like you and I want to. The program managers are very dedicated. They come to work for federal agencies for a fraction of the salary that they could earn if they were to choose to work for companies. And they're dedicated. So I found this newfound respect for them as colleagues. And I say this in jest, but I learned to use Microsoft Word. No matter what your ideas, they had to be explained in a single Word document succinctly. Try to explain to somebody who's a policy wonk what a cyber physical system is and why it's important, what are the drivers, what is the impact, and what the fundamental issues are in one page. Had to be done in a Word document. I also had to use Microsoft Outlook, but that's a different story. I had to use the local, there was no Wi-Fi. I ran my own rogue Wi-Fi hotspot. I shouldn't be saying this in case others are listening in, but there are a lot of things that were a bit awkward at OSTP for me. And I believe all of you should think about becoming policy wonks. Why, particularly today? Because you understand technology. The timescale of technology is truly much, much shorter than the timescale of a human, which is decades, and the timescale with which humans adapt. And it's definitely a lot faster than how politicians adapt, who are not trained in technology. So this is why I think it's more important to have more people thinking about this. I mentioned a big societal challenge is displaced jobs, but there are other societal challenges: safety, security, privacy. And ultimately, I go back to Parker and Spider-Man. I learned this many years ago, and then I discovered that this is a truism. Many people, including Voltaire, have said this: with great power, and we surely have great power since we're technologists, come great responsibilities. And I think this is something very important that all of us should embrace. Let me stop here. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Delighted to take questions if anybody has any. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. As I mentioned earlier to everyone, all the attendees here, if you have questions, I see a few coming in the Q&A. We as the panelists will ask these to Vijay. So I want to open up to our other panelists, Rebecca, Leah, and Walker Gosrich. If you guys have some questions, go ahead.
Yeah. So going straight from the Q&A section, someone asked, how were you selected for this position? Did you volunteer? Were you recruited? And is there an interview process?
Well, I was recruited, but it's not a position that's advertised because these are unfunded positions. So I got to know people who asked me if I would be interested, and then I get a call from Tom Khalil. I think Lynn Parker said something similar to it. Somebody calls you from the White House and says, would you like to be part of the team? It's hard to say no, but I have to admit, I was very nervous going into this. I'd never done anything like this. And then I had to find funding for the position. I was also fortunate. I had a sabbatical coming up, and I used that. And Tom was able to find other funds to support my position through societies like IEEE and CRA. And so all that worked out. So it was just, it was great timing. it was also a great time in my career. I was approaching my own midlife crisis, and rather than buy a red sports car, I decided to go to the government. So
while you're thinking back to the time when you took this position, I was wondering what motivated you to accept this position, what sort of hopes you had for what you might get done in the OSTP, and looking back now, whether you actually got those things done.
that's a great question, Walker. I think this is hard for most of you, but you really have to go back to 2007, 2008 to 2012. Robotics was far from being a done deal back then. And so in some sense, we didn't know if this was going to pay off. And the fact that we are the lab we are, the fact that all of you are here, I mean, that's already beyond my wildest dreams. And, the fact that we started the National Robotics Initiative, I can probably, I don't want to sound too arrogant here, but I think a lot of the reasons why we are may actually go back to the NRI. So to me, that was a huge thing. I think the same thing is true for cyber physical systems. Today, there are many universities that have CPS hiring initiatives. I'd like to think that I played a very, very, very small part on that. And of course, in the government, the first thing you realize is that no matter what you start, you have to let others take the credit for it. Very different from academia. So I would be the first to say it wasn't just me, it was a whole bunch of other people. But to be part of that, I think to me was very exciting. What did we get wrong? I mean, I think I really do think that we got immigration wrong. And I do think I wish we had thought more about jobs that would be displaced. Not jobs that would be lost, because I truly believe we did create jobs, but jobs that were displaced. In some sense, you look at the polarization that exists in our country, perhaps in other countries as well. Technology plays a huge role. It exaggerates gaps. So, that's something that we all have to bear, at least I have to bear the responsibility partly again.
Yeah, Vijay, in the end there, in your talk, you talked about thinking about the kind of socioeconomic demands and impacts. And I'm curious, a lot of our audience here today they're grad students, and I'm curious what role we play, or maybe should play, as graduate researchers in thinking about these socioeconomic demands and impacts.
I think, one thing is, first of all, kudos to you guys to start this SFI seminar series, inviting people like Lynn Parker. I think you should do more of that, so people are aware of these issues. And again, Penn is an international place, GRASP is an international place. I think it's okay to focus on domestic policies, but we really should be thinking about things that cut across countries, cut across continents, in particular the global South, where we know very little about the challenges there. So I think that's item number one. Item number two, I do hope, now if I ask a incoming student, I ask, well, what career options are you exploring? They'll likely say, well, I thought I want to do academia, but I want to go into industry, or I want to do industry, but I think I'm going to try academic positions. Well, there are a lot of interesting positions in government. I mean, don't expect a 7-figure salary anytime soon, but it is a great way to have impact. And I can just tell you that, I love Philadelphia, but Washington is just a great place. So I would urge you to think about that. And again, I have a U.S. focus here, but I do think that, again, I'm looking at Dan's question about Facebook. I do think the more of us are engaged in these discussions, the more literate we will be, technologically literate we'll be as a nation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, kind of actually, I want to dig a little bit deeper into Dan has this question about substantial policy choices are made by the House of Representatives and Congress, where it seems like countless, of these Congress people are not necessarily technologically fluent, and like how do you envision that we could actually, so obviously becoming more involved is really important, but how could we actually improve that information pipeline? For example, like one thing that I've been thinking about recently is there's this case of Oracle versus Google, which is recently at the Supreme Court, and they had to explain to the Supreme Court like what is an API and how API shouldn't be like copyrighted. And I found that very interesting, but it was also very like disheartening to be like, wow, okay, these people who clearly don't know what these things are making these decisions that really impact the rest of us and also the world, right? Like Facebook is an international company, so stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, Rebecca, there's no easy answer to this, but I do think that we do it in our own way. If you've written a National Science Foundation proposal, you talk about broader impacts, and you're talking about impacts beyond, oh, if I prove this theorem, surely I'll be able to show optimality, completeness. No, that's not the impact. It's about society, right? And I think we force ourselves to think about that. And I think that's very, very important. It's a framework. If you're going to get money from the federal government, from taxpayers, you got to think about that. I think to me, that's very important. The other thing which GRASP under Dan Miller, Ueda's leadership and CJ's leadership does a spectacular job of is outreach. Again, that's an important, that should be part of our core mission, right? The question of how do I reach Senator Orrin Hatch, and I'm glad he's retired now, but that's a more of a trickle down effect, and I truly believe it's happening. I do see both Republicans and Democrats being a lot more educated, especially those that are closer to being digital natives than perhaps Senator Hatch. So I think that'll also happen over time. But above all, I think if somebody invites you to give a talk in a public setting, it may be outside your comfort zone, but I think it's our responsibility to try to do it. And again, no matter what part of the world you come from, that's an important skill.
Great, thank you guys so much. Unfortunately, we are actually over time. We have other questions lined up, and I have a million, so I'd love to continue this discussion. But unfortunately, we have to end here. Thank you, everyone, for coming and participating. I suggest to everyone, if you want to keep having discussions about this among GRASP, go to Slack and start up some conversations there. Vijay, thank you
Matt,
again.
can we run a poll on who people think will win, Biden or Trump?
You can run that on Slack if you want.
No, 42 participants. We can predict the outcome on Friday.
Oh, man.
All right, very good. Thanks again for inviting me. It was great. And I know there were some other questions that were not answered. Happy to take this offline.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Bye.